Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kelvin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's already time for part 3 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. That's right, somehow 5 new cards have already been revealed since my last review, so I couldn't wait. I had to jump right back in. In those 5 cards, there are 2 Legendaries and 3 other cards, but of course, Legendaries are always pretty exciting, so I can't wait to see these. As always, here's how this review is going to work, guys. First, I'm going to talk about each of the cards at pretty great length and discuss them as much as I see fit. But if you're someone who doesn't have a ton of time and just wants to see the new card reveals, I have included a link in the description below where you can skip ahead to the end of the video where I'll be running through each card rapid fire style, just giving them a star rating from 1 stars to 5 stars. So hopefully that's convenient for those of you who don't have a ton of time. But if you do want to join me for this full card discussion, of course, I'd greatly appreciate that. So let's go ahead and jump into this card review. Starting off with the first new legendary, it's the Warlock class legendary. Of course, every class is going to be getting a Death Knight hero card and a legendary minion like we saw in the past with quests and legendary minions in Unguro. For Warlock, this time it's Blood Queen Lana'thel. She's one of the Ice Crown Citadel bosses, so a pretty familiar name for anybody who played Wrath of the Lich King, and a pretty expected character to see as well. As for the card itself, it's a 5 mana minion, has 1 attack and 6 health. By default, clearly lifesteal here as the keyword, but also an extra effect in that she has +1 attack for each card that you've discarded this game. So basically blending the lifesteal keyword into the discard mechanic for Warlock. So first things first, is this card any good? And I have to sum it up and say, unfortunately, I really don't think she's going to be very powerful. There's a lot of problems here with this one. Discard doesn't look very good right now, but beyond that, even in a world where you assume Discard Warlock is actually a strong deck, maybe they print a ton of new discard cards in Frozen Throne and that becomes a tier 1 deck, I still don't think Blood Queen Lana'thel is actually a very strong card, simply because as a 5 mana minion, how much does she really accomplish? She's often maybe a 3/6, a 4/6 on turn 5 if you play her, because you just haven't had that many turns or opportunities to discard that many cards. So on curve, she's a merely mediocre statted minion with a moderately small lifesteal upside. Even later in the game, if you get her up to 7/6, 8/6, 10/6, etc., in the late game, she's a minion that's fairly easy to remove because she only ever has 6 health, so Fireball kills her regardless of how much attack she has. She still dies to single target removal. So I think that means in aggro matchups, she probably just doesn't do enough. She doesn't have taunt. She can be ignored and just, because she's only healing for 3 every turn. The opponent doesn't have to do anything. In the late game, no matter how big she is, she's still susceptible to all kinds of removal and not that strong in a control matchup. The other problem with lifesteal inherently is that it's just not an active instant effect. So it takes a long time for lifesteal to really build up value. Clearly it synergizes with what Warlock's trying to do, because Warlock's often taking a ton of damage using spells and their hero power and so on and so forth. So it makes sense, but I just think that the heal cards Warlock has traditionally run to mitigate that risk were heal cards that did it instantly and in big chunks. Of course, Reno Jackson, the primary example of that, but even things like Anti-Killbot, like you just needed the heal instantly. Blood Queen Lana'thel takes a while to get rolling and doesn't always necessarily have a ton of upside. Not to mention, of course, as is the case with any card in a discard deck, she just has a chance of getting discarded, which makes her useless because you don't get to use your big powerful legendary, which really, in my argument, isn't even all that powerful in the first place. But even in a world where you stick her on the board, she has 10 attack and you get to heal for 10. Healing is a resource gain. You gain that health as a resource. But health as a resource in Hearthstone is ultimately one of the least valuable resources, right? You're okay to sacrifice health all the time to gain things like tempo and board presence and value. So restoring that health doesn't actually accomplish anything in and of itself. Like, yes, you maybe can sacrifice a little extra previously to gain some tempo and some value back, but Blood Queen Lana'thel is not a guaranteed lifesteal. She's not a guaranteed heal, so that becomes a pretty big risk. And she herself just only offers you passive benefits, right? You're just gaining some extra attack with these discards, which is a big downside. If you're sacrificing health and counting on her to recover it, that's another big risk and another big downside. There's just a bajillion different ways running through my head right now of why this card probably won't work very well. It doesn't seem to fit in any kind of given deck. very slow. The upside is incredibly limited, and frankly, even in the best environment, on the best turn, in the best deck, in the best matchup, I still think often she's just like a Boulder Fist Ogre, right? Like just a pile of stats. Because lifesteal at the end of the day probably won't make that much of a difference. Maybe in some world if she's a 15-6 and you play her when both players are out of cards and you're taking fatigue damage every turn, maybe she could keep you alive to win the game. That's like the one scenario where I see a ton of value out of this card, but ultimately seems to fall pretty flat. For a class that needed a really powerful, active, instant, strong legendary, this one does not seem to make the cut. So I'm a little sad to see Blood Queen Lana'thel wasted, in a sense, as a prominent, awesome raid boss for Icecrown Citadel with a card that, at the end of the day, seems very bad. So let's move on to the next legendary card that was revealed. This is another one of the princes in line with Prince Keleseth, but this time it's Prince Taldaram. And instead of being a 2-mana 2/2, this is a 3-mana 3/3, but with the same condition for his battle cry. You can't have 3-cost cards in your deck. And if you meet that condition, then that allows you to turn Prince Taldaram into basically a faceless manipulator, right? But actually a worse faceless manipulator, for the record, because faceless manipulator, when you make a copy of a minion, you get to keep all of its stats and its effects. With Prince Taldaram, if you copy a minion, you only get to keep its effect. You don't get to keep its stats. So it's always a 3/3. If you copy that Tyrian Forge Ring, you have a 3/3 Tyrian Forge Ring instead of a 6/6 Tyrian Forge Ring. So for 3 mana, which is 2 mana less than a Faceless Manipulator, I would argue you have a considerably worse version of the card. That said, the 2 mana difference is rather substantial because you can, of course, play things like Cairn into Prince Taldaram on the same turn and create 2 really solid minions. There's a lot of minions and examples in the game where the upside is on the effect and not in the stats. So there's all kinds of ways you could high roll Taldaram. Things like Malagos or Ysera, you maybe don't care about the stats nearly as much as you care about the effect. So still, obviously, a lot of ways to benefit here on top of things like Faceless Manipulator, but also downsides to that, right? Because you can't do things like buff a Leroy Jenkins with Power Overwhelming like we've seen in the past and then copy it with Faceless Manipulator. That worked as a crazy combo. Can't do that with Prince Taldaram because when you copy that Power Overwhelming Leroy, you get a 3/3 charging minion back, right? So the upside and the kind of crazy combo potential seems a little more limited. As far as whether or not this card can be played, at the end of the day, I really don't think so. Not running any 3-drops in your deck is incredibly difficult to do. So many classes have really powerful 3-drops. I mean, even in the last expansion, Tar Creeper and Stonehill Defender are just like synonymous with Hearthstone at this point. They're in every kind of deck. There's other things like Arcane Intellect, Hex, like just a bajillion, a crazy amount of 3-drops that are really, really good that most decks just wouldn't be willing to sacrifice. So that's a big problem. Now, clearly you don't necessarily have to build your deck to support this battle cry. This could be the kind of card in a control deck you just hold until the end when you've played all your 3-drops because you've played so long into the game, and use this as sort of a kind of a crazy control tech card where you can answer anything your opponent plays by making a copy of it. So if they play the Tyrian, you can get your own Tyrian and generate some value via a slightly smaller Tyrian, admittedly, but it doesn't have to be on your own minions. In other words, this has just a copy of a minion, so it can be opponents or friendly. So there's potential also maybe with some kind of crazy combo decks if you can get a Malagos and you can double your Malagos, that kind of stuff. I don't know exactly how that would look, but you can probably think of things with even like the Ancient One, for instance. You could probably get an Ancient One out with this card. So who knows, right? There's really fringe potentials. But ultimately, it feels like the kind of card that's just going to be way too hard to utilize, far too difficult to meet as far as the condition is concerned, far too compromising to your deck, and I don't really see enough upside consistently to make this the kind of card that's run. I wouldn't be totally surprised if some crazy deck, though, finds a way to use this in a really creative way, particularly in combination with cards we haven't seen yet, because, of course, we haven't seen a whole ton of Frozen Throne cards. There might be some stuff that supports this one particularly well, some interesting combo or unique use for this. So I'm not totally writing Prince Taldaram off. There's a chance this card sees play occasionally, but for a legendary, it really does feel way too specific, way too inconsistent, and like it'd be very, very frustrating to try to make work. Up next is a new warrior weapon called the Blood Razor, and by the way, this artwork does not really match up with the Blood Razor weapon that I'm familiar with in World of Warcraft, but that's okay. It's still got a cool name. This is a 4-mana weapon. It's a 2/2 as far as attack and durability are concerned. Has a really cool familiar battle cry for warrior players. It does 1 damage to all minions on the battle cry, and it also does 1 damage to all minions on the death rattle. So I guess this is sort of the modern day replacement for Death's Bite, the 4/2 weapon that did 1 damage only on death rattle. It looks really similar in a lot of ways. I don't think it's as good as Death's Bite, unfortunately, and Death's Bite was a really, really strong card that was ran by basically every version of warrior. Perhaps most prominently by Patron Warriors, where it really synergized with their combo, but everybody liked it all the same. I don't think Blood Razor is quite as good as that, but that was such a crazy good card that it doesn't have to be that good to be played. And I still think this card could find some utility. This one has grown on me a lot the more I've thought about it. Essentially, when you play it, it's a 3/2 weapon right away, right? Because the battle cry is dealing damage to a minion. You can hit that minion for 2, so you've done 3 damage. So the front half of it looks a bit like a Fiery War Axe, but also a Fiery War Axe that has that whirlwind upside. And of course, Warrior has a lot of ways to utilize whirlwinds itself. You know, hitting that Acolyte of Pain, for instance, but also just being able to whirlwind a board of minions is really fantastic because there's so many different little tokens out there these days. So, you know, kind of a Ravaging Ghoul in a weapon gives you a little bit more charge than your Ravaging Ghoul traditionally has, because usually the Ravaging Ghoul can just do 1 damage and then you can't chip off the rest of the pieces if there was a 3 health minion. This allows you to do that and gives you some flexibility. Plus you get to bank this other whirlwind effect and get to use it basically whenever you want, assuming, you know, no weapon removal or whatever it may be, but you get to bank it and make some decisions. Not to mention, you could actually activate both these whirlwinds in a single turn if you had like a Fiery War Axe. And I mean, there might be opportunities where sacrificing 1 durability on this weapon is absolutely worth it to get that whirlwind effect immediately. So you could actually do 2 damage to an entire board if you're willing to play both weapons. So that's a neat little combo potential, I guess, too, because Warrior does typically run more than just 1 set of weapons. So between the ways Warrior can benefit from this, between the way it answers really aggressive boards nicely, I think this is a playable card. I don't know exactly which decks would love it. I certainly don't think it's in like a Pirate Warrior deck, because ultimately 2 damage is way worse than 5 from something like Arcanite Reaper to the face. But in more tempo Warrior decks that love whirlwinds, or control Warrior decks that just need ways to answer big boards of little stuff, this seems like a tool that could fit in pretty nicely. I don't think it replaces Fiery War Axe ever, but it could be an extra little complement. You know, place a card like Ravaging Ghoul in some decks or in some metas, and as Ravaging Ghoul rotates out in the distant future, this might be something that fills in that slot a little bit too. So this feels like a playable card to me. Not a class-defining card, not in every deck, not meta-defining, but playable, solid, nice little card. And then up next we have a neutral epic minion, a 6-mana Nerubian Unraveler. It's a 5/5, and when it's on the board, spells cost 2 additional mana. That would be both for your opponent, but also for you. And I really like where this card is going, but that said, I still don't actually think it's going to be played very much. In other words, I really like being able to interact with your opponent's turn and your opponent's resources. I mean, the first comparison card that comes to mind for this for most people is probably Lotheb, because Lotheb was a 5/5 that made spells cost more. But it's not hard to see why this is like 10 times worse than Lotheb. First off, the spell penalty is considerably lower than it was with Lotheb, right? So that was a 5-mana penalty. So you can still cast a lot of things with Nerubian Unraveler on the board that you couldn't cast with Lotheb. Flame Strikes can still go out with Nerubian Unraveler. They couldn't with Lotheb. So it has less of a direct impact that way. The other part of the problem here is that Nerubian Unraveler can very simply just be killed to remove this debuff, this spell penalty. If they have a couple minions on the board they can trade in, guess what? None of the spells had any penalty at all. Lotheb was just a guaranteed effect. You played it, it was a battle cry, so it went off for sure. It completely disrupted their turn. There was nothing they could do to play around it, so it had a lot more decisiveness. Now, obviously, there are a couple benefits of a minion like this. If it does linger on the board, it can persist across multiple turns, whereas Lotheb only did a single turn. But at the end of the day, Hearthstone is a game about a turn-by-turn big moments, big plays. It's not typically that kind of lingering style where you're expecting to build a ton of value from a single minion over multiple turns. That rarely ever happens. If minions are staying on the board for multiple turns, you're probably winning the game anyway, and this is not the kind of card that's decisive enough or important enough in its effect that's going to put you in a winning position if you weren't already in a winning position. So in other words, try to imagine to yourself, what deck runs this? Is this a better 6-drops than 6-drops that are available to decks in the first place that would want to run a slower 6-drop? And I think almost always the answer is no. You can probably find a better 6-drop for every deck out there. The only time I could ever see this thing, any kind of fringe playing constructed, is if there was some super heavy combo spell-based deck. I mean, Miracle Rogue comes to mind, right? But even that, I don't think Nerubian Unraveler would be that strong against a Miracle Rogue, because they could just use a 4-mana Eviscerate and still go to town the following turn, right? It wouldn't be that problematic, in other words, for Rogue to get through this. So just, it doesn't, if it had 6 health, maybe it'd be a little better, 7 health, 8 health, that kind of thing. Like a 2/8 would be better because it'd be harder to remove, but at 5 health, I think it just dies a little too easily. Doesn't force the penalty strongly enough, doesn't do enough for its cost, and just doesn't fit into very many decks. So I love the idea. It's cool that, it's kind of a counter card. It gives access to additional resources. Neat design. At that level, nothing particularly brokenly bad about the card. It's not terrible. It's not understated. The effect is strong. It's a lot of the pieces are there. They just don't fit together very well, and this is not the kind of card that's strong enough, in my opinion, to really make the cut in a 30-card list. And then finally, I have a card which is hot off the presses, as you can tell from both its artwork and its name. This was an official reveal from a streamer, but it was in Portuguese, I guess, so the translation here is not probably correct. This would be a weird name for a card, but the stats and the effect are absolutely right, so I thought I'd go ahead and toss this one in, because we do know it's a real card, just don't know exactly what the name's going to be. But it's a warrior minion at 3 mana. It's a 4/3, and it has a really interesting death rattle here. If it's your opponent's turn, you gain 6 armor. So this is really one of the first effects we've seen that's an on-board conditional effect based on your opponent's turn. Clearly we've had some other turn-style effects, but never one quite exactly like this. So just looking at this card at a top level, great stats for its cost. I mean, 3 health, obviously a little bit susceptible for a 3-drop. You traditionally rather see the opposite allocation where you get 3 attack and 4 health, which I think is especially true in more control-style decks that are looking to play a little bit slower and less aggressively, which this kind of card would support with this armor-based death rattle. I don't think you'd want to run this necessarily in a more aggressive deck, despite its more aggressive stat allocation, just because often that death rattle wouldn't really benefit you. But, all that said, the fact that it has 3 health is less problematic with this card thanks to its death rattle, because essentially the problem with 3 health is that it gives your opponent a lot of opportunity to kill it on their turn. They can trade 2-drops into it really easily, they can use those frost bolts to kill it, but they're going to be disincentivized to do so because they don't want to activate its death rattle. So what that means is you get to play a 3-drop here that's got pretty solid stats, and it becomes a high friction point for your opponent. They say, man, I don't want to have to deal with that. I'm going to let him make the trade so he does not receive the benefit of that death rattle. And then when they pass the turn back to you, suddenly that means you get a minion that has a higher attack value than normal and can trade into bigger things. It can trade into 4-drops. Can maybe trade into the occasional 5-drop. So you get to benefit from this, what would normally be kind of a backwards stat allocation, more than you traditionally would, simply because your opponent feels like they don't want to kill this thing lest they give you an advantage. So normally I would much prefer the 3/4, but in this sense it actually makes a lot of sense. Frankly, a 5/2 with this death rattle would be pretty cool too, because it could trade up into even more and create even more friction for your opponent. I almost wish they'd gone harder in that direction and made it a 5/2, right? That Ice Rager stat line, which has never historically made a lot of sense, but when the death rattle causes this much trouble for your opponent, suddenly it could start to make sense, and it'd be the kind of sacrifice you'd be willing to make, simply because you're getting a pretty big advantage. 6 armor for a control warrior deck is a substantial gain for only 3 mana and a minion on the board that's presumably trading in or eating some sort of resource. So neat little design here that forces some decision making from your opponent, which I really like. These kinds of things don't happen often enough in Hearthstone. There's way too much random stuff. This is a neat little controlled effect that can really determine how a game unfolds based on small decisions in the early game. Can have a big impact later. This is also Death Rattle minion, of course, so there are some Death Rattle synergies to consider with things like N'Zoth. You know, Control N'Zoth Warrior has been a deck in the past, and this makes a lot of sense in that environment too. So I like this quite a bit for a number of reasons. Now, all that said, I'm not sure this card gets played a ton. I think it's good. It's fundamentally solid from a stat and effect standpoint. Makes sense with some synergies too. But not every list is going to need a card like this necessarily. You might want more instant armor gain or active, you know, battle cry style armor gains. You might just want more defensive minions like a Tar Creeper. For instance, a Tar Creeper might just end up giving you more health than a Mountainfire Armor ever would. So there are still some decisions to be made here. I do not think by any means this is like an auto-include 3-drop in every slower warrior deck. It's nothing like that. But it is the kind of card that could make sense in Death Rattle, maybe certain iterations of Control Warrior, or in certain metas where 4 health minions in particular are really prominent. I definitely do think this card can be played in those kinds of places. So it's got the potential to do some work, just not going to be the best card ever for Warrior, but still fairly good and certainly a playable, usable card. Okay, so that wraps it up for my in-depth reviews for those 5 cards. A little bit of a mixed bag, a couple playable cards there, a couple, unfortunately, pretty terrible ones, I think, that won't see a ton of play. But interesting designs, and I have to give Blizzard some credit on this little set of cards. They're thinking about stuff, they're doing things new and unique, trying some different things, they're being clever in the design. So even though I don't think necessarily these cards are going to have a big impact on the game, I still like the line of thinking and the direction that the cards and the designs are being taken in. But all of that said, now I'm going to run through these cards really quickly and give each of them a 5-star review from 1 star to 5 stars, just to sum up my opinion and give you guys something to judge me on when it's time to talk about these cards 3 months from now when we actually know how good they are. So you guys can take screenshots of my happy face getting things absolutely wrong. So let's jump into these quick reviews. I think Blood Queen Lana'thel is unfortunately only a 1-star card. Prince Taldaram is a 2-star card just because he does have a very fringe combo potential in my mind. Blood Razor is a 4-star card. Nerubian Unraveler is a 2-star card. And Mountainfire Armor, in my opinion, is a 3-star card. And there you have it. That's part 3 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. I'm curious what you guys have to say. You always shed so many fantastic insights on all these cards. You tell me why I'm wrong, you tell me why I'm right, and I love to hear all of it. So of course, leave your take on each of these cards in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.